and everybody's animals are gonna be
Giving it
sacrificed.
we just read in the Haftarah on the Chanukah Sabanis of
They-
Shlomo, where he outlawed fasting on Yom Kippur that year. They brought to celebrate the Shlomo's sacrifices. They did 120,000 sheep and 22,000 cattle,
It's a lot.
and the copper Mizbeach couldn't handle it. So they used the whole Azara
Really, for
to do
that.
checking, and they had to do it within the daytime hours, Saturday night.
How do you guys handle it?
So then we sort of calculated that they were doing a carbon like every 1.5 minutes or something.
That's pretty amazing.
And you have to cook it to eat it.
Well, barbecue.
Well, that takes time too.
Okay, everyone. I apologize for the tech gremlins that are living with us. These takes a while to get back into the swing of things. But let's get started. Page 452. If you remember last time, we spoke about the position of the Nitziv that given the three types, the three categories of woven objects that were used in the Mishkan. What were those three categories? So the first category was what we're talking about here, the yirios, right? These were the woven garments that went on top of the building. I don't want to say on top of the Mishkan, because if you remember, we saw that these garments themselves, these objects themselves, might actually be referred to as Mishkan. So they went on top of the structure, on top of the structure. And there were two other categories of woven garments, two other instances of woven garments, if you will. The first was the paroches. The paroches was the curtain that separated between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Right? Remember, within this structure, there were two chambers, the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the separation between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kadoshim was done through the paroches. There was one other instance of a woven object, and that was the masach. What was the masach? The masach was the entrance to the entire structure of this Mishkan. In other words, when you looked at the structure ahead of you, the first thing you saw was this curtain called the masach. If you went through that curtain, right around that curtain, you entered into the Kodesh. In the Kodesh was the menorah, the shulchan, and the mizbeach hazahav. And if you looked directly ahead of you, you would notice another curtain. That was the paroches. And if you went around past that paroches, you entered into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Of course, we couldn't do that, but the Kohen Gadol could do that on Yom Kippurim. That was not something that we were allowed to do. But those were the three instances of woven garments, or woven objects. The yirios that were overhead, the paroches, the curtain of separation between the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the masach, the curtain of separation between the Ohel Moed and the rest of the courtyard of the Mishkan. If you remember what the Nitziv said the order of materials is listed differently when it comes to our yirios and when it comes to the paroches and the masach. The paroches and the masach are in one group. Our yirios are in another group. And what is the difference? So if you remember, I mentioned that the Nitziv said the difference is, are all of the plies let me just explain. If you take a thread, a thread is often not a single ply. What is a ply? It's a layer, right? Like you buy tissues, right? If you have a cold, you don't want to buy single ply tissues because
It gives strength.
it falls apart in your hand. Okay, I'll stay above the neck, right? So you want to buy a double ply or something like plies or levels. So rarely is a strand of thread one ply. The only time it is one ply is if it's a very strong monofilament, in which case it could be one ply. But the threads that we are used to dealing with are not single ply. What are they? They are 2 ply, 3 ply, 4 ply. So what does that mean? How does that work? So let's say you had a 4, how would you construct a 4 ply thread? You would take these 2 plies of thread and these 2 plies of thread, right? And you would wind them together here into one strand, one thread. That would be 4 ply, okay? How many ply were the threads that were used in the weaving of these yerios? So we learned that they were 24 ply,
So it's thick.
right?
Each
It's
thread is
hard
thick.
to imagine. I actually tried to find a picture of something that was 24 ply. I mean, it's not something which is made. It doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist because nobody uses it now. But specifically for the curtains,
I would think that silk, which is made out of spiderweb or silk moth kind of fiber, is like so fine. I'm just guessing. Yeah, it's who knows how many little fibrils to make one silk thread. But
could be, I don't know, but I'm just talking about a regular thread. If you imagine a regular thread and make a thread now of 24 ply, that was the thread that was used to weave these curtains.
Yeah.
And the Netziv questioned whether or not all 20, first of all, sorry, let's back up. How did they get to the 24 ply? Right? What did they take? 24 different threads? 24 different color threads? No. We know that they took 6 4-color threads, right? 6 threads, and 6 strands, and each strand was 4 ply, and those 6 strands were then woven, twisted into a single strand. That's how they got the 24 ply. Each of the 6 strands that we start with have 4 strands in them, okay? That's how we get the bottom line to be 24. So each of them has 4 strands. What are the 4 strands? So strand number 1 we mentioned was linen. And strand number 2 was wool of a techeles color. Strand number 3 was wool of a tola'as color. And strand number 4 was wool of a, what was the last one? Techeles of an argaman, right? Argaman. So it was 1 strand of linen and 3 strands of colored wool. Those were woven together to make one thread. And then 1 strand of linen, 3 strands of colored wool woven together to make 2 threads. And there were 6 of those threads, and each of those threads was 4 ply. And those 6 threads were then woven together, literally tied together, right? Wrapped around each other, woven together to make one 24 ply thread. That 24 ply thread was what was used to weave these urios, these I guess tapestries, if we'll call them, these tapestries that served as the roof of the Mishkan, okay?
Because it had those two colors, it created a pattern also.
It was a multicolored pattern because it had the linen, which was off-white. Then there was a wool that was dyed purple. There was a wool that was dyed techeles. There was a wool that was dyed tola'as shani, which is like a crimson. Okay, so crimson, purple, this blue, this turquoise, if you will, plus the off-white of the linen, were all woven together. We're all wound together to create one thread. And then 6 of those threads were wound together to create one thread that was now used to build these, to weave these urios. These urios were obviously very hefty urios. Heavy, hefty and strong, which explains why they didn't make one urea that covered the entire thing. What did they make?
2, and then they attach.
No, what did they make? They made 10 urios,
Well, it's like a runner.
right? Well, sort of, yeah. They made 10 urios, and they attached the 10 urios all on the long side. They attached the 10 urios. Why? Because to weave one urea that would be that long, which was a minimum of 20 amos, because the Kodesh HaKadoshim was 10 amos, the Kodesh was 10 amos, so it had to be a little bit more than 20 amos, a little bit more than 30 feet. Can you imagine one tapestry that would be made out of threads that thick that would stretch for 20 feet? It would be impossible to move. It would be impossible to move. So what instead you had pieces that were attached together. Those were the rios. So the Nitziv said, it's not that we have one strand with equal sizes of linen, wool dyed turquoise, wool dyed crimson, wool dyed purple. It depended on what was being made. So for instance, in the urios, in these tapestries that went over the structure, I'm just going to say over the structure for now, what was mentioned first? So what was mentioned first was sheish moshzar, which is the linen, and then tcheles, the wool that was dyed turquoise, the argaman, the wool that was dyed purple, vitolas shani, the wool that was dyed crimson. Which is mentioned first? The linen, the off-white color of the linen. Okay. Now, if you jump ahead, says the Nitziv, to page 458. At the top of the page, verse 31, what do you see? At verse 31, you see V'asisa paroches. Now we're talking about weaving the paroches. And what is the order here by the paroches? Tcheles first. What was the order by the urios first? What came first by the tapestries over the building? The linen. What comes first by the paroches? The tcheles. So tcheles, the turquoise, the argaman, and the purple, the tolah, shani, and the crimson, and then finally the sheish mashazar, the linen. Go to Pasuk 37. A little bit down on that page. What does it say in Pasuk 37? We're on page 458. What does it say? V'asisa l'masach. You make the masach. The masach was the screen, the dividing curtain.
36.
I'm sorry, 36, right? Thank you. V'asisa masach, the Pesach ha'ohel. Again, what does the masach say? Tcheles first, argaman second, tola ashani third, v'sheish mashzar fourth. So what do you have? So you have this idea that for the paroches and for the masach, first is mentioned Tcheles. For the 10 yurios, what's mentioned first? Sheish mashzar, the linen. Says the Nitziv, the Torah doesn't switch the order just by happenstance. There is a message which is being taught to us, conveyed in this switching around. What is that message?
If you created these 3 threads, you couldn't discern the difference. The naked eye would not be able to say this one was made this way and that way because they're all spun together. So it's one thread spun, it sort of blurs.
So what Eddie is saying is correct. If the threads are of equal dimension,
And they're all twisted
then they
together.
all blur together into one, basically, kaleidoscope of colors. But what happens if the threads are not of equal dimension? In other words, what happens if in these 4 threads of the paroches, the linen is a bigger thread? And it will stand out. And what happens if in the paroches and the masach, the tcheles, the wool thread that was dyed turquoise, that's the bigger thread. What's going to happen? That's going to stand out. So in effect, says the Nitziv, the predominant color of the urios that were overhead was the off-white of the linen.
Right.
Even though it had these other colors mixed into it, it was the off-white of the linen.
And the masach is the
For the paroches and the masach, the predominant color was the tcheles.
like the shomayim.
Right, so now the question is why? Right? Why is that the case? Why by the paroches and the masach was the predominant color tcheles, although the other colors were mixed in? And why by the urios was the predominant color the off-white of the linen with these other colors mixed in? Okay, so I mean, which do you think is more easily visible to the Kohen?
Or eye attracting, you mean?
Correct. What catches the eye of the Kohen in his normal daily activities?
Yeah, garments of white, and then you see colors.
Linen.
Of bigger colors, yeah. Linen.
What's the difference between the way a native New Yorker walks down the sideway in Manhattan and the way a tourist walks down the sideway in Manhattan?
The tourist looks up.
Correct. What does the native New Yorker do?
Watches where he's going.
He watches where he's going. He looks in front of him because he knows it's a maze out there. So he looks in front of him. The tourist, where does the tourist look? The tourist is looking up all the time. In fact, the native New Yorker is watching out for these tourists who are looking up all the time, right? So this is, imagine the Kohen who is coming every day into the Mishkan, every day into the Kodesh, to light the menorah, to clean the ashes, to deal with the lechem apanim, to offer the ketoras. What is he looking at? He is looking predominantly at the tcheles. The tcheles is going to remind him of, right? You know the progression, right? That's what he's looking at predominantly. If he looks up when he's inside, what is he going to see? He's going to see predominantly the off-white of the linen. So now, I'm not an interior designer, but this much I know. If you want to make a room look bigger, what do you do with the ceiling?
It's a light ceiling.
When you say light, what does that mean?
It means like it's
a light color.
A light color.
You paint it a light color. If you want the room to appear smaller, right, you paint it a dark color. Essentially, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was teaching this lesson, says the Netziv, in the Mishkan. In other words, you walked into the Mishkan, there was not a lot of light. There was the menorah that gave off the light, but there was no sunlight coming in. There might have been some sunlight filtering in around the masach, if you will, but you had these heavy urios on top. So in order for it to not to feel claustrophobic, we're imagining that the what you looked up at would be of a lighter color.
So why go to the trouble of mixing all of these colors if you want the ceiling to be whiter and lighter, and why just have
Tina.
not have white?
Tina, you can't ask these questions of an interior designer, let alone the ultimate interior designer.
Okay.
I mean, clearly each one of these colors symbolizes something. I mean, we're familiar with what tcheles symbolizes, but what does argaman symbolize?
Royalty.
So we know argaman symbolizes royalty. What does tolas shani symbolize?
Are they-
Crimson? No, crimson signifies averos, right? Crimson signifies transgressions. So these are all wound, right? They're all wound up together. So one approach, which is the approach that we started with, said they're all of equal proportion, and therefore when they're all spun together, as Eddie says, you really are not hit with any particular color. You're hit with all of the colors. They all sort of blend together because they're all spun together. But according to the interpretation that we saw of the Netziv, they are not all of equal weight. The
one that said first
is it correct, is the predominant weight, and therefore that's the predominant color which comes off of the paroches or the masach or the urios. Okay. Now, every Friday night, we say the following Mishnah. Kol hayotze min ha'etz eino mitame tumas ohalim ella, finish the sentence, ella what? Ella pishtan. Okay? Let's where is this from? So in the davening of Friday night, we have the Bameh Madlikin. The Bameh Madlikin is the entire perek of Shabbos, Masechah Shabbos, the Mishnayos, which are learned, or I wish I could say they were learned, they're more davened up, if you will, between Kabbalah Shabbos and Mariv, right, between the end of Kabbalah Shabbos and Baruch Hu. Why Bameh Madlikin? Why do we choose this? Go ahead.
Because I believe in not having the flame during Shabbos, so this was to confound them, because we are allowed to light with various things, so it's important.
Is that true?
I've heard that once.
Okay. I mean, basically what we're talking about.
Eventually wind up with lighting
Right.
subjects.
So basically what we're talking about are lighting of Shabbos, ultimately Shabbos lights, and the different kinds of wicks that are acceptable and the different kinds of fuels that are acceptable. And it could, I've never heard the explanation that it's because of the Karaites, but...
That's why they had that particular Mishnah, I guess, because they could have had
right, but it might very well, I'm not saying that it's not true, might very well be true. So you have this idea of the Bameh Madlikin. In the Bameh Madlikin, it says as follows. But let me just, another piece of background, I'm sorry. We've learned, have we learned? Not sure we've learned. We haven't learned. There is something called Tumas Mace. Right? We know that there is a ritual status that a person can have which is a status of being tameh. What does that status of being tameh mean? It means the person is ritually unable to participate in certain holy rituals of Jewish life. So if I am tameh, I am not allowed to enter into the Beis HaMikdash, to certain areas of the Beis HaMikdash. I am not allowed to bring certain karbanos. I'm not allowed to do certain things. And depending upon the severity of that level of tuma, it is possible that I can transmit that tuma to, let's say, food. And if I transmit that tuma to food, so then somebody who is not tameh can't eat that food. So there is this state, we're all familiar with this idea of tuma. Tuma, which is mistakenly translated in English as impure or unclean, does not mean either of those two. It just happens to be a linguistic contrivance, right? But it's not impure, it's not unclean. It means unable to participate in certain rituals.
And if you go to the mikveh, afterwards you
Now,
can-
correct. Now there is a way to transform yourself from unable to participate to able to participate. And how do you do that? By going to the mikveh for most cases of tumah, by getting sprinkled with a mixture of water and ashes of the para aduma for the case of tumas mace. There are ways in which to remove or to transition from not being able to participate to participating. Rav Soloveitchik has a fascinating explanation, which I'm sure you've heard me say at one point or another. Soloveitchik has a fascinating explanation as to why one is not allowed to participate in these rituals when he or she is tameh. And according to Rav Soloveitchik, it has to do with the way in which the person became tameh and the proximity of that experience to death. The closer the proximity to death, the more severe the level of not being able to participate is. Why is that? Explained the Rav much more eloquently than I ever could. Explained the Rav that Judaism is a religion of life. And therefore, when one comes into contact with death, one becomes unable to fully participate in the rituals of Judaism, which are life-giving rituals, until a certain period of time elapses, until one goes through a procedure that restores one to this state.
So if a person is a soldier in an army, right? He, by definition, he's tameh,
Why?
because he's in the battlefield.
Okay, so?
So he's near people who die.
Right, so now the question is, when we talk about near people who die, so clearly the major source of tuma is a body, right? That's what we call avi avos hatuma. If someone touches a body, a dead body, they become an av hatuma, right? In other words, they're not as major as the actual body itself, but they are, like, let's call it one step removed, okay? Now that's because they have physically encountered that body. But there is another way for a person to become tameh without ever touching that body. Granted, it is more distantly removed than touching the body, but it is called tumas ohel. What is tumas ohel? It is when you are in the same room as a dead body. meaning when you are in a room where the roof is shared both by over you and over the dead body. This explains why Kohanim are not allowed to go into chapels, funeral homes. They're not allowed to go into funeral homes. Why? Because inevitably in the funeral home is a dead body. And there is going to be Tumas Ohel as a result of that, which is why they have separate rooms for the Kohanim, which is why in some places the funeral homes were built with a divider in the roof to separate between the areas, so there was a spot for the Kohanim to go to. That's Tumas Ohel.
So does that mean a Kohen can't become a doctor?
We had,
Not a dentist.
we had
a
Kohens in our medical school, and they raised the issue in anatomy lab.
Listen, this goes back to, I remember being at YU and pre-med and all these discussions about can a Kohen become a doctor, can a Kohen not become a doctor. So I will tell you, back in the day when I was in that parsha, so to speak, there was no other way to gain experience of the body other than cutting open a body.
So he goes to the mikveh.
Right? There was no other way to do it. So he was going to become tummy. All right, he was going to become tummy. Okay, he was going to become tummy. So his reasoning was, it's okay for me to do this. Why? Because I'm ultimately going to be able to take this knowledge and use it to save lives, use it to protect others. There were those rabbis, I would say more of those rabbis than these rabbis, who said, no dice. Can't do it. Right? You can't do it.
Can't become a doctor.
Right? You can't do it. Why? Right? Look, you could become a doctor if you could deal with not touching a body in anatomy. And I personally know Kohen doctors who somehow work that deal out. In other words, they had a lab partner, and they convinced the lab partner to do all the dissection and the moving around, and they just watched.
But there's still
But
Tomei
they're still sharing
Ohel.
the room.
Oh, they're still sharing the room, which brings us to the next detail, which is that Tumas Ohel only applies if the corpse is Jewish. If the corpse is not Jewish, so then Tumas Ohel does not apply. Okay, fascinating insight. Right? If the corpse is not Jewish, then there is no concept of Tumas Ohel, because of the sanctity of a Jewish body, as opposed to a non-Jewish body.
Yeah.
A Jewish body housed the Jewish soul. A non-Jewish body housed the non-Jewish soul. There's a difference in sanctity between those two kalim, if you will. So the question then becomes, well, how do you know that the guy you're working on is Mr. McMurray or McAllister? Maybe he's Mr. Goldberg.
Go by majority in the
Oh, so you go by the majority. The majority of cadavers that were used for medical school anatomy class were not Jewish.
In Israel?
That's an interesting question. Okay. Today, by the way, it's much less of a shiloh.
But there's a remedy for that. Maybe they go to the mikveh.
No.
Do what they gotta
So
do.
a Kohen, Rob is asking an interesting question. In other words, so what's the big deal? Go to the mikveh.
Yeah,
I go to the mikveh.
Right.
So why is that not an answer, Mike? Why is that not an answer, Les? Why can't you just go to the mikveh afterwards?
Every Friday, the medical student.
Because Tumas Mace is not something that gets removed by going to the mikveh. There's only one way in which Tumas Mace can be removed, and that is by being sprinkled with the waters of the Para Aduma,
Which you don't have.
which we don't have. So basically, every single one of us is Tamei Mace, and when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, Bimheira v'Yameinu, there will be a Para Aduma. That Para Aduma will be burnt, and its ashes will be mixed with water and be sprinkled on all of the Kohanim and all of the people who are Tamei Mace. Now, how that Para Aduma is going to be prepared is a fascinating conundrum. Why?
You have to be.
Because you have to be a Tahor Kohen to prepare it. So how do we get a Tahor Kohen if everybody's tummy? It's an interesting conundrum. Obviously not for tonight, so you have tuma. You touch a body, you become tummy. You're in the same room as a Jewish body, you become tummy mace. There's all kinds of fascinating laws that are associated with this. So if I would say to the average Kohen, "Are you allowed to go into the cemetery?" What would you tell me? No, you're not allowed to go into the cemetery. You would tell me the same thing? You're not allowed to go in the same cemetery. You're not allowed to go into a cemetery. Why not? Why can't you go into a cemetery?
Well, there's no roof
You're
there.
near dead bodies.
So you're near dead bodies. So let's say that there are really wide roads and you can walk down the center of the road and you won't be within 6 feet of a dead body that way or that way. Can you do that?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
You have to watch out for trees.
Right? So the answer is yes. Kohanim don't go into cemeteries because it's too complicated to figure this out. In other words, they don't know that they're always going to be able to maintain a distance of Dalet Amos. They don't know that they're going to be able to avoid a tree that overhangs graves on one side and the road on the other. Let's say you have a tree that's growing, right? And the foliage of the tree, the branches of the tree, part of the branches overhang the graves, part of the branches overhang the road. You can't walk under the branches of that tree. So because it is so difficult for a Kohen to do that, Kohanim don't go into a cemetery. Is it theoretically possible? Yes, it is theoretically possible.
One of the consequences of all these halachas is the Christian story of the Good Samaritan, because that's what it was all about. So people passed by, they were Jewish, and they were possibly Kohens, and they were in touch with their body. The Good Samaritan took care of the sickly person who might have been in the process of dying. And,
Okay, that's above my pay grade.
It's actually, I mean, if you love your parents, it's actually an emotional downer, not to be able to visit on your sites and things like that.
Which is why traditionally we always buried family members of Kohanim along the fence of the cemetery. In other words, at the outer boundary of the cemetery. Why? So this way, their descendants could visit the graves on the yurt sites. Because I can stand 6 feet away from the grave, and the grave is right there. It's not like, I go to the road and the grave is somewhere Dorton, like 2 blocks in or whatever it is.
Well, it depends on the cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, today, by the way, today basically doesn't happen. Today there's no, you can't, it's nigh impossible to purchase plots near the fence of the cemetery today.
You can't?
Because they're all gone.
What?
They're all gone.
I mean,
They're all taken, right? And not only by Kohanim, but they're all taken.
what's the halacha if someone's Kohen's walking along and there's a dead body and it needs to be respected?
So we know that's called a mace mitzvah. And even the Kohen Gadol on the day of Yom Kippurim is obligated to attend to that mace mitzvah. Right? So from that perspective, it's a no-brainer. Right? From that perspective, it's a no-brainer.
If you're a doctor, you're a Kohen, and you're working in a hospital has a roof, and inevitably
You're gonna have
You go visit someone in the hospital.
you're gonna have these issues. Yeah. What about if you go visit? Right? I
You
remember.
visit a friend in the hospital.
I remember in Washington Heights, when I lived in Washington Heights, Hatzalah in Washington Heights maintained a list of all of the Kohanim in all of the buildings in Washington Heights. So that if they were called for an emergency and they would go into 4J and Mr. Goldberg in 4J was in cardiac arrest, what would they do? So most of the people would deal with Mr. Goldberg. But there was one person who would take the list and go through the building to tell the Kohen to get out of the building.
Wow.
Right, to get out of the building because but visiting a hospital is so what do Kohen, you've visited people in a hospital, I'm sure you visited people in a hospital, what do you rely on?
Yeah, what do you rely on?
I just asked that question.
I know that. There's certain halachas,
Less?
it would be a
They're not Jewish.
Oh, you rely on the fact that the majority of people, the majority of Americans are not Jewish. And the majority of hospital patients are not Jewish either. Even in predominantly Jewish areas.
Even in Manhattan or Brooklyn?
What do you mean, even in Manhattan? Yes, of course.
Like Maimonides Hospital, the majority in that.
That's correct. In Maimonides Hospital, the majority of patients are not Jewish.
Really?
St. Francis, the majority of patients are. I mean, all of these places. These are huge facilities, and the majority, you would assume that the majority are not Jewish. As a result of that, you know, you're not worried about Tumas Ohel. Of course, in Eretz Yisrael, right, in Shari Tzedek or in Hadassah, it becomes a much more complicated situation.
What do you do?
So a hospital that is makpid about halacha, such as Shari Tzedek, will have separate storage area for corpses. People who die, and before they're removed from their room, they're taken to the morgue. The morgue is in a halachically separate building from the rest of the hospital. Now, again, it's possible you're a Kohen who's going in, and the minute you walk into the hospital, somebody dies. Okay, but you don't, that's called ein ladavar sof. In other words, if you worry about,
Well, some of them have divider doors that close automatically.
yeah, they have they have these issues, right? They have these issues. And now, I mean, another piece of this, which we're not going to go into, but what if you're a Kohen and you're going to fly to Eretz Yisrael and you get on an El Al flight? How do you know that underneath you in the cargo area is not Mr. Goldberg? And maybe Mr. Goldberg is underneath you in the cargo area, and you happen to be sitting on top of Mr. Goldberg. So, what a Kohanim rely on. So I know there are some Kohanim who will only fly from Newark, because they say that the most of the bodies that leave New York leave from Kennedy, and not from Newark. So there's a much less of a chance that you can't just call up the airline and say, by the way, any bodies on this plane. Doesn't work. They don't answer that, right? But the majority of bodies are flown out of JFK as opposed to Newark. So there's some people some Kohanim who will only fly Newark. Others depend on various halachic leniencies, such as what? Well, that could be, but they, as a separation between the body, and then the casket itself becomes like the ohel, and that blocks,
It's more blockage.
right, makes it like that's the ohel and not the whole plate. Okay, now, why did I mention all of this?
Oh, little pressure. If everybody today is really
Tamei Mace,
Tommy,
correct.
why do the Kohanim keep all this? You tell me anyway. You have to have a bar.
Because Kohanim are not allowed to put themselves in a position of Tuma. The rest of us are not proscribed from becoming Tamei. If we become Tamei, we have to deal with it. But we're not proscribed from becoming Tamei. The Kohanim are proscribed from becoming Tamei. So even if they are already Tamei, they are not allowed to become, quote, more Tamei. Even though there's no practical ramification of that, they're not allowed to become more Tamei. Okay? That's the short answer. This is the answer why, if you want to go to the top of Har Habayis today, right, you have to go to the mikvah. You have to remove some tuma from you. But anybody who wants to go up to the top of Har Habayis who's Jewish, right, you have to remove some of the tuma. But even with going to the mikvah, it is very... There are very clear guidelines as to, well, I shouldn't say it. There are guidelines as to where you can walk and where you can't walk. And you can't walk in certain areas because you are still Tamei Mace. So in the Beis HaMikdash, there were areas where a person who was Tamei Mace could walk. And there were areas where a person who was Tamei Mace could not be. Which makes sense that there were mikvaos all around the Beis HaMikdash.
So you had to go to a mikvah.
So in other words, you go to the mikvah to get rid of any other tuma that you might have, some kind of emission or some kind of secondary kind of tuma that you might have. So you get rid of that tuma, but you couldn't get rid of the tumas mace without the paraduma. And when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, ois paraduma. So, okay, why did I mention all of this?
Why did we get into this?
Right? Why did I mention all of this? Well, there's still one more piece, right? No, she didn't take us. Tina did not lead us astray here. There's still one more piece tonight, and what is that piece? Are you allowed to cover your sukkah with metal poles? Can you take metal poles and run them across the roof of your sukkah?
No.
Why not?
Because it's metal's cherev. It's like.
Would it be natural? Say natural.
Because it has to be something which is natural. What does it mean, natural? It has to be something which grows from the ground. It has to be separate from the ground, but it has to be something that grows from the ground. Why?
Because it has to be able to take on tuma. It has to have the property of...
Just the opposite.
It doesn't take on.
Right? Correct. In other words, we want, because things that grow from the ground cannot be mekabel tuma. A piece of wood cannot be mekabel tuma
Why?
because it is considered a natural substance.
And iron or metal, aluminum.
Even though they are mined from the earth,
Right.
they don't quote grow from the earth.
And I thought it's because you make weapons out of them, out of metal, you make a cherev, like a cherev, a sword, so.
I mean, it's a nice thought. And I'm not gonna,
But fruit can take on tuma, therefore you can't use fruit.
people use fruit they decorate their schach with fruit, right? So something that grows from the ground is not mekabel tuma unless it is fashioned into a vessel. If I take a piece of wood and I fashion it into a spoon or something like that, it now can become tameh because it is now a kli. It is now an object that has a fixed purpose.
Is that the reason why people use the mikvah for their dishes? Is that?
Absolutely nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. Okay, now, one of the materials that is used in the weaving of these tapestries, I'm reeling us back in now. One of the materials used in the weaving of these tapestries is linen. Sheish mush zar. What is linen?
From flax.
Linen is from flax.
Original.
Right? Linen is from the flax
Vegetation.
plant. Right? Linen is the fibrous stalks within the flax plant. Okay? It's technically a vegetable. It grows from the ground. Linen technically grows from the ground.
Right.
Okay, good.
The wool does not.
What?
The wool.
Right, the wool does it. It's from a.
Wasn't wool used to make threads?
Correct. I mean, you're right, but I'm going a different direction. Okay, I'm going a different direction here. What's this direction? So let's say that you have we spoke about tumas ohel before, right? We spoke about tumas ohel, and that is if you have a building. If you have a building, it creates, and there's a dead body in that building. So you walk into that, and it's a dead Jewish body. You walk into that building, there you become tameh from tumas ohel. Okay. What if that ohel is made up of vegetation? What if that ohel is made up of, or if it's an ohel which is made up of cement and metal and things like that, all of those things are mekabel tuma. All right, so there's no question. I have a corpse in there. If there were a corpse in this room, we'd all become tameh, tameh meis through tumas ohel. But what if we took a sukkah, right? What if we took a sukkah and the top of the sukkah were bamboo poles, right? And the walls of the sukkah were made out of wood, and there was no metal involved in the sukkah at all.
Does that become?
All right?
too much?
Is that considered? And there's a corpse inside your sukkah. In other words, you bench one night, you go in, and you don't realize till the next day. Not everybody came in. Right? You go out the next day. One of your guests is still in the sukkah, right? Along with the raccoons.
Well, we mentioned before that, the tree in the cemetery could be an ohel.
The tree in the cemetery could be an ohel because it is alive.
It's like it can be attached to.
It's alive.
You can't have a tree.
You can't have something alive. In other words, I can't take a tree and bend the branches of the tree over my sukkah to be used as schach.
No, you can't do that.
It has to be separated from the tree, right? Separated from the ground. Okay? The tree in the cemetery is not separated.
It's still
Okay?
in the ground.
Now, so let's go back to our Mishnah again. Okay? I'm going to do it slowly. Now, Friday night, when you hear this Mishnah, it's going to ring all kinds of bells. What does it say? Tani kol hayotze min ha'etz. What does that mean?
Everything that comes from a tree.
Anything that comes from a tree, meaning anything that grows from the ground, anything that comes from the ground, comes from a tree, is the product of a tree, is vegetation. Eino mitame tumas ohelim. What does that mean? Translate that.
Doesn't make things, impure.
Doesn't form an ohel
No hell is sealing.
to create tumas ohel. Ella pishtan.
Just
Except for flax or linen. Right? Except for flax.
why?
Great question. The Mishnah asks that question. The Mishnah says, minalan. That doesn't make any sense. Where does that come from? In other words, flax is from a plant that is detached, and the fibrous material of the plant is what flax is. How can you be any more gedule karka than flax?
Unless it harkens back to the issue between Cain and Abel.
No. That was Mike last week, right? Or a couple weeks ago. But listen to what we say. Says the Mishnah. Right, so that's the Mishnah. Kol hayotze min ha'etz eino metame tumas ohelim ela pishtan. Says the Gemara. It's a Yerushalmi. Says the Gemara. Minalan. Why? Why? Answers the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Min ha-mishkan lamdu.
We learned it from
How do we know this? Because we learn it from the Mishkan. Because what does it say about the Mishkan? The Mishkan says, Dichsiv, because the Pasuk says, the es ha-mishkan ta'aseh eser yirios. Our Pasuk, right? For the Mishkan, you have to make 10 tapestries, 10 yirios. And one of the materials from those yirios was sheish mosh zar, right? Sheish mosh zar is linen, which is basically spun out flax, right? Linen is made from flax. And through a series of other connections in 3 psukim, we learn that the sheish mashzar is actually pishtan, and since it is used by definition in the making of an ohel for the Mishkan, it by definition is classified as ohel. In other words, anything that grows from the ground, anything that grows from the ground is detached, and you make it into a building, you make it into a covering, a roof, whatever. There's no tumas ohel in that, because it's not considered an ohel, with one exception. And what is that exception? Flax. Why? Because the Torah itself tells us that making an ohel was the material of flax. It was part and parcel of the ohel of the Mishkan. Right? So now, listen again. Tani kol hayotze min ha'etz eino mitame tumas ohalim. Whatever grows naturally and is then cut down and used to make an ohel, eino mitame tumas ohalim. It doesn't create an ohel to permit tumas ohalim. Ella pishtan, with the exception of pishtan. Why? Because our pasuk defines pishtan as the defining covering of an ohel, right? And because of that, pishtan is the only natural material that can create tumas ohel. Okay.
Also, what about Tumat Behemah? There was a lot of shechting there in the Mishkan, I mean, right?
You don't become tameh from it touching an animal that was shechted.
No?
That would mean you're tameh every time you eat something.
Okay. And what about in Nevela? Same thing?
Nevela is different. A nevela is different. A nevela can cause tuma, but an animal that was shechted properly does not create tuma.
Interesting.
But if you take that rationale about the name, now there's the title of ohel, therefore it's an ohel, then the other ingredients also would.
Of course, but we know the other ingredients are, by definition, ohel. In other words, wool is not something that grows naturally from the ground, right? And the other ingredients were dyed wool, right? Wool that was dyed purple, wool that was dyed.
Why do we learn about wool?
We don't need to learn about wool. We don't have a havamina that wool shouldn't be tumas ohel. We do have a havamina that pishtan should not be tumas ohel, because pishtan is gedulei karka.
Right, it's the exception.
So this Friday night, and every Friday night when you say Bameh Madlikin, and you come across this pasuk, Kol hayotze min ha'etz, you come across this Mishnah, Kol hayotze min ha'etz, eino mitame tumas ohelim ela pishtan, you'll think of our Thursday night class.
Well,
Why?
Why do you say it then? Why do you say this particular kapitel before, Erev Shabbos?
You're making a separation between Kabbalah Shabbos and Mariv. In Eretz Yisrael, they daven Kabbalah Shabbos, and then they wait 40 minutes before they daven Mariv.
We don't do that here.
Correct. If we did that here, I wouldn't have a minyan, right? No, we don't do that here, right? We had daven Kabbalah Shabbos. We say a break, we break between the two by reciting this parak of Mishnayos as quickly as we can.
10 seconds.
Yes, at least. And then we go right into Mariv. Okay, we go right into
You
Mariv.
can't say Marav early. Like, you could bring Shabbos in early, but you can't say Marav early.
No, you can bring Shabbos in early by saying Mariv early,
Oh, you can say Marav.
but they don't do that in Yerushalayim.
Here you do.
Here we do. I mean, there are some places in Yerushalayim that do it, but I'm talking about a place that davens bisman. A place that davens bisman, they say Kabbalah Shabbos and then they wait before Mariv.
Do they go home or they just stay in the synagogue?
Stay there.
For me, the amazing mission is number 5
The amazing Mishnah is number 5. What is?
in that series.
What does it say?
It talks about if you're afraid of going in or whatever, you could be machabed in there. You could put the light up.
Right.
Yeah.
But the test is a subjective test. That's the point. It's not an objective test. So if you personally feel threatened, even though there is no threat, you can be
That was also Hanukkah with the
fascinating.
I mean, look,
That was
we just finished a holiday.
Yeah, the Zoroastrian.
We just finished the holiday of
And they were
Sukkot.
scared, right?
The whole obligation of being exempt from the sukkah is absolutely subjective. What makes you mitzta'er might not make me mitzta'er. And the level of what makes you mitzta'er might be a level that I'm comfortable with.
Like one of their worship.
In other words, maybe I'm willing to sit in the sukkah if it's a little bit chilly. If it's 50 degrees, maybe I'm willing to sit in the sukkah. But somebody else might not be willing to sit in the sukkah if it's 50 degrees. For them, it's mitzta'er, it's too cold. It's purely it's purely subjective.
Okay, the yammer is just to go in and out of the sukkah, but to be machabed in there on a Shabbos, that's.
Okay.
Fasting and Yom Kippur is the same thing.
Why?
You know, you get a doctor's opinion, a rabbi's opinion, but ultimately it's your opinion that counts, right?
Mm,
I mean, it has to be validated a little bit, right?
no.
but
I grew up in-
It has, you have to be in a position of pikuach nefesh, not to fast. Or that you'll come to pikuach nefesh.
When we were on this last trip, we went to the consecration camp in Poland. Rabbi Weil, who was leading the group, said Kohanim can go in. The non-Jewish tour guide, absolutely Kohanim cannot come into the cemetery.
So you know what the difference of opinion is? The difference of opinion is whether there are any bones left in that concentration camp. Now, what's terribly disturbing is that when I walked through the concentration camp of, not of Treblinka, of Birkenau, right? The Auschwitz, right? When I walked through with the tour guide, every 5 steps he stopped and picked up a little fragment of bone.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
It's
No.
still there.
Yes.
It's
They're
a
coming
God.
out from the ground.
After all of these years, it rises to the top of the soil.
Really?
Yeah, we saw that.
It's tragic. But these are like, little tiny pieces of bone. Right? Little tiny pieces of bone are not mitame. Which is why Rabbi Weil said Kohanim can go in. Kohanim. But in an actual cemetery where we say there are atzamos, there are regular bones, we're not talking about, yes, maybe bones have disintegrated.
Why then is the Kohen allowed to go into a room in a cemetery for a parent or for a sibling?
Because-
Or a spouse?
Because
Torah says.
the Kohen is the proscription of becoming Tameh is waived by the Torah when it comes to the Avelus of a normal Kohen. I mean, not a Kohen Gadol. For a regular Kohen, when it comes to any of the 7 relatives, and included in those 7 relatives is an unmarried sister, as differentiated from a married sister, the Kohen is no longer proscribed from becoming Tameh. He's going to become Tameh, but he's not violating a prohibition by becoming Tameh.
Even a Mason mitzvah, if there's nobody else around.
The Kohen Gadol, on his way to do the Avodah on Yom Kippurim, has to take care of it. No question. Okay, I kept you very late tonight. I'm really sorry. We'll see you, Yirtz Hashem, next week.
Let me say, next week, Tina's not going to